been done with a Democratic president, Democratic Congress. It hasn't worked. We know who to throw out of office. Isn't this, to some extent, this kind of polarization an aid to accountability, or is that not right?
No, it's not right, unfortunately. Look, at one level, if you have one party holding all the reins of power and the votes are clear, all on one side and all on the other, we can have some rough approximation of a parliamentary system, which presumably does have accountability. Although interestingly, if you notice, every country with the Westminster system now has divided government in a sense because it's a coalition. They don't have a majority anymore. So even that's breaking apart. But what kind of accountability is there first when the vast majority of the members aren't accountable? Because no matter what happens, they can't be defeated in a general election. They're not accountable to the country as a whole. They're accountable to the fringe of ideological activists. And at the same time, the nature of, I believe, of our democracy, and this is something really you see in the discussions and debates of the framers around the Federalist Papers, the notion of how you govern an extended republic. Not a city, not a small homogeneous country, but a huge country. Of course, back then, it would take you days to go from Philadelphia to Washington. They didn't anticipate a country going from ocean to ocean. But where you're going to have places like Wyoming, where you have a small collection of people in a very sparsely populated area, all the way through to the incredible congestion in the cities, how do you govern and maintain some sense of unity and not fall apart on regional or ethnic or other lines? And there the idea was, of course, that you're going to have a division of powers, and you're going to have extended deliberative debate, but a recognition that if you're going to make anything happen, you're going to have to use it to build some kind of consensus when you're doing things that affect people's lives, that you can get a broad, bipartisan, or more leadership consensus so that people are willing to accept the short-term pain for the long-term gain. If you end up in our culture with the equivalent of a parliamentary system with responsible parties, it does not lead to a broad acceptance of the changes that are made. And we see that now with the healthcare issue, where if you go back to Medicare or Social Security, there were deep partisan divisions before they ever passed. You look at the language used by Republicans about Social Security in the 1930s, a socialist takeover and all of that. But when the Social Security was actually passed, it had very substantial Republican support joining with the Democratic support. The same with Medicare. Not this time. And now you've got half the political process dedicated, once the law has passed, to destroying its implementation. I was at a session last week with John Boehner, kind of an audition to be speaker in a way. He was talking about reforming the House and actually said many reasonable things, but in the Q&A, somebody asked him about the health care plan, and he said, well, of course, we want to repeal and replace it, but let me tell you, we're going to make sure that this is not implemented smoothly. We're going to cut the funding. We're going to, basically, they're going to harass the people who are going, if they're in the majority, to go to implement this plan. That's not a healthy way to have a process work. I would add one other phenomena here that I didn't much talk about, Larry, which you alluded to. One of the vexing difficulties with redistricting now, though, in a way that can help this process, create more competitiveness, and which means also creating more heterogeneity in districts, is that we've had a lot of geographical sorting out, not just by regions, but people moving into areas with other like-minded people. So these districts are not just safe, but they become echo chambers. When people go back home to their districts, they're not hearing diverse points of view. And that means they don't have to represent diverse points of view. I still very much remember that eloquent comment made by a former representative from Louisiana who actually almost became Speaker of the House until his personal failings brought him down, Bob Livingston. Bob Livingston had a district outside of New Orleans, and for much of the time that he represented it, it had about a 20% African-American population, solidly Republican district. But
he, first of all, believed as a representative he had a fiduciary responsibility to represent everybody in his district. Second, he didn't want to piss off 20% of his district where they would turn out in large numbers that could create problems for him. So what it meant was he was just sensitive. He voted for a Martin Luther King holiday. He didn't use offensive rhetoric. He was, very careful if issues came up that might have a deleterious effect on his district. And then through redistricting, because of course a lot of what we saw in the last 2 decades was Republicans joined with minorities to create safe minority districts, because that meant opportunities for Republicans to gain some strength elsewhere. His district lost its minority population. It moved into a district that was where they were packing in minority votes, and it went down to maybe 5 or 6% African American population. And his successors don't have that same phenomenon. So one of the problems that we have is as people begin to move into areas where they're like-minded, it's hard, if you're going to maintain some of these other virtues like compactness of districts, to actually create heterogeneous districts as well. And that's a phenomenon that we've got to worry about as a society, because that kind of fragmentation in an extended republic is going to make it much harder to come up with policies where there's some sense of consensus around what we're doing.
Great, thank you very much. Just 1 or 2 more questions on the situation we're facing in our politics, and then we'll get more into redistricting. You heard a lot of Republicans say, and let's take the health care reform as an example, that voting as a bloc against health care reform was the right thing to do. It wasn't a national interest because it was such an extreme piece of legislation. And indeed, if you look back to the Medicare example, here you had Wilbur Mills, conservative Democrat who chaired the very powerful Ways and Means Committee in the House, who deliberately balanced the larger government role in financing hospital care with a voluntary program for doctor services, what's now known as Part B in Medicare. So what do you say to Republicans who say at this point that, that it really is the right thing to be opposed to bad legislation? Isn't that reasonable?
I must say, I find, many elements of this puzzling. We ended up with a health care plan that did not have a public option. And Alice Rivlin, who is, very much a fiscal conservative, but a nonpartisan observer, was talking about last week about how she saw the development of these exchanges as the best opportunity to actually create a real competitive market in health insurance, which we haven't had. There's no market in insurance. I can tell you when my oldest son, who went out and used his Ivy League degree effectively, avoiding finding a job that paid that had health insurance for many years, and when he went off COBRA, I had to go out and try and find him a health insurance plan. And I didn't know what I was doing, but I went, there's e-insurance, and I thought, oh, this is great. Somebody's taken this on. You can go in, and there's a spreadsheet, and you put in the age and the other phenomena. And then you start to look at health insurance plans, and it's like buying a mattress. They're deliberately obfuscating so that you can't do any comparison shopping whatsoever. And you can look at some of the basics and think you've got it, but any of the fine print that tells you what actually matters if you really get sick, what kind of coverage you're going to have. So there is no market. And so I actually find, a health care plan that, if you're going to describe it fairly, is basically a combination of Mitt Romney's Massachusetts plan joined together with the Dernberger, Chafee, Dole plan from 1993-94 that was the alternative to the Clinton plan. The idea that this, which is in effect the moderate Republican alternative from years past, is some radical socialist takeover of the healthcare system is bizarre, frankly. So I don't buy that. But I also think that if you play by the rules of the game and Congress passes a bill and it is enacted into law, as a representative, you have a fiduciary responsibility to try to improve it if you can. But you also have a responsibility to try to make sure that you do not disrupt people's lives as it's implemented in the name of either ideology or some partisan game. And that's what I fear is going on here. And once again, it gets to some basic questions. We're struggling over what is legitimate in government. And if you start to challenge the legitimacy of the other party when it's in the majority, you are headed down a really bad path. That's why when I focus on, you know, the notion of Obama having been born in this country, especially, this isn't just some sort of, you know, weird little sideshow. It's basically nearly half of the self-described members of one party saying the president's not legitimate. He doesn't meet the constitutional test to be president. If you start with a premise that your president isn't legitimate, where does that take you in terms of your ability to come up with consensus policy that can meet some of the other tests that we have? It's just not a comforting or safe thought.
So we can be safe in the thought we will have elections in about 4 weeks' time. And Barack Obama came into office promising a change in how we did things in Washington. I think everyone would agree that's not worked out well for him. Yeah. We're going to see probably Republicans winning the House and making some real gains in the Senate, maybe even getting the majority there. Do you think things will be better because we're going to have this change election? Will this create a kind of lessening of the polarization or not?
No, it's the opposite, I'm afraid. I mean, brace yourselves. We're headed for a very, very rough couple of years. First, the approach that Republicans have used in the minority has worked wonders for them. You know, think back to what we were discussing 2 years ago in the aftermath of the 2008 elections. You had a Republican Party that was in terrible shape. Now, it's axiomatic in this country that when you start to see stories written that a party is dead, you can already begin planning for their resurrection. And we've seen that with both parties many times. But, you know, remember that you had a party that in 2008 got trounced in every growth area of the American electorate. Young voters, Asians, Hispanics, African Americans, and was left with a base of white, middle-aged males, which my wife points out every day is not the reliable group of people that you want to base your future on. And, you know, numbers down almost to a trace element, and all of a sudden they're back in a big way with the possibility of one of the most stunning change elections in modern times. So what's the approach going to be of the leaders? It's going to be, boy, that worked wonders. Vote against everything. Even when they win, make it really ugly. Denounce it after it happens. And if we just double down on that strategy, 2012 gives us the whole enchilada. So it's going to be very difficult to find areas for compromise. And frankly, in this polarized environment, when you have leaders encouraging the most over-the-top rhetoric, how do you as a leader, if you decide a year from now that it's time to compromise, go to your rank-and-file troops and say, well, yes, he is a socialist, communist, fascist, illegitimate president, Manchurian candidate who's undermined America, but now it's time to work deals with him. They're going to say you're a traitor. So that's going to be very difficult. And, you know, if I've talked to several of the Republican senators who were up in 2012, and I'm nervous because there are some really good people who have histories of legislating. Take Orrin Hatch of Utah, who of course is, you know, a very conservative man, but who has been proud over the years of the number of bills that he has enacted into law working with his very dear friend, the late Ted Kennedy. Well, his wing buddy, Bob Bennett, couldn't even get on the ballot this time. And Orrin Hatch, who's up in 2012, is already facing a challenge from a young upstart conservative House member named Jason Chaffetz, who's said that he's not going to let Hatch just waltz through. And it's the same extreme elements at their convention process. Orrin Hatch is not going to be cutting deals with Ted Kennedy's successors. He is going to be moving as far to the right as he can to show that he is as hard line as anybody could be. And many others, like Bob Corker of Tennessee, a terrific first-term senator who bucked his party to go out there and try and cut a deal on the financial regulatory reform. He's looking at a neighbor of his from South Carolina named Bob Inglis, a House member who is one of the most conservative House members, who couldn't break 30% in a runoff primary because he voted for TARP and because he refused to say in his district that Barack Obama was a socialist. Literally, he will tell you that he would go to town meetings and they would demand that he call Obama a socialist. And Bob Inglis would say, look, we are at the opposite ends of the political spectrum. I'm for small government, he's for big government. But Barack Obama is a good family man, a patriotic American, and he's not a socialist. And that was the end of his political career. Well, you know, South Carolina is not Minnesota, and it's not even Tennessee. But if you find that if you don't use the extreme rhetoric, and, you know, he said many of the people who are demanding this were longtime friends of his, but they sit at home and watch Glenn Beck. And they come out and think, well, it must be true. And they're demanding fealty to Glenn Beck. If we have a political process where the deciding factor is what Glenn Beck says, I'm going to start looking at property in Australia.
Norm, I've got a series of questions, and I'm wondering if we could move through them
on
an expedited basis. First question is, right now we're focused on a Democratic president and Congress. But just to be clear, this is not, you know, one party being kind of oppositional and the other not. Thinking back to President Bush's presidency, you had this whole series of policies, Social Security reform, which, you know, you might differ on his proposal, but I think there's a pretty wide agreement. We got to do something. And he couldn't even get a vote, and Democrats were, you know, as oppositional. So would you agree that this kind of oppositional politics is something we're seeing on both sides, or is that not right?
It's thoroughly a two-way street. You know, both sides want to gain traction because what matters is winning a majority, and the differences are great enough that you can justify almost anything in order to get into the majority. And, you know, when I actually began to get a little truly uneasy and frightened about this was not the Social Security phenomenon, but the surge in Iraq. And what got me troubled was, all right, it was done. And I talked to a lot of Democrats who were hoping it wouldn't work. It's one thing to oppose it and to believe deeply that this is misguided strategy and we shouldn't be there in the first place. But when you've applied something and your national interest is at stake, and clearly you are better off as a country if it works and you can bring some level of stability to Iraq, and if it doesn't work, Americans are going to die, and you get a mindset that because this president has done something you didn't like, you want it to fail, that's just dangerous, and it's you know, even the stakes are even higher there. Now, you know, partly what I fear is, I do believe that in where we are now, it's asymmetric. That it's partly because Democrats, having won and pulled in a substantial number of moderate blue dog Democrats into their fold, even doing it with one party alone, they couldn't move off to the left. They actually had a center that they had to accommodate. And they will continue to have a center that they have to accommodate, at least in the short term. The big losses are going to come among the blue dogs, but there'll be a significant number of them left. It's the Republican Party that has virtually purged its moderates with a trace element left now, and that has sort of moved further off onto the right. But let's face it, if Republicans make big gains, the first thing that Democrats will do reflexively is to start to demagogue Social Security and Medicare. the old mainstays that have worked to their advantage. And you can see Republicans actually using the health care plan. I see it, you know, in my trip back here now and all of these ads. We were talking before, Eric Paulson apparently has an opponent, which most people didn't even realize, but he's running ad after ad after ad talking about how his opponent is trying to cut Medicare. And Boehner the other day was talking about how the first thing that they want to do in the health care plan is to repeal the $550 billion in cuts in Medicare. They want to get on the side of Medicare. Now, in the process of doing that, which is in part to guard against Democratic demagoguery, we saw this bizarre phenomenon, as you know well, in the health care plan, where the party of fiscal responsibility signed a pledge, basically, that they would protect every dollar of Medicare from now into perpetuity, which means forget about fiscal responsibility. But this distends and distorts the rhetoric, and therefore it ends up leaving you with no policy options, and nobody has clean hands here.
Great, thank you very much. We've got a series of questions about redistricting and how to draw the lines. Here in Minnesota, as you know, Vice President Mondale, Governor Arne Carlson, Majority Leader Larry Poggemiller, Senator Ann Rest, a number of Republicans, and Tim Penny and the Independence Party, business leaders, civic leaders, came together around the idea of an independent commission that would make a recommendation to the legislature about a map. What are some other ideas out there in the country that you find compelling for folks in Minnesota who realize we got to do something about how the districts are being drawn and are looking for something to make it less toxic?
Well, you know, there is no perfect way to do this, of course. I think the best example that we have, you have a couple of states that have done it well, Iowa and Arizona, basically. And a model where you have an independent commission, you've got to have some breadth on that commission, but where you've got a series of criteria that they need to pay attention to. And you can't set out one or another as the criterion. But for me, competitiveness has to be woven into this in a substantial way. I want districts where representatives have to believe that if they don't appeal to people on both sides, that they could be in jeopardy, rather than believing that they only have to appeal to one small side. And I want competitiveness because I think competitiveness also builds in some heterogeneity so you get dissident voices. That, along with the usual criteria that we know, compactness, contiguity of districts, communities of interest, ought all to be in play. And there has to be a recognition that we're not going to create 435 seats that could change hands in every election. And we shouldn't want to. You do want some substantial level of continuity. You do want people who can get in and know that they are likely to be there for a significant period of time and then make a commitment to the institution of which they're a part. But you want to have enough, 100, 150 districts, where you have some genuine opportunity at any time for somebody to lose in an election to create a different level of responsiveness. And the only way that I can see doing that is to take it, in effect, out of the hands of legislators and put it into the hands of people who have some sensitivity to politics. I don't just want pristine judges who don't have any idea what the political arena is like, but who are not driven by just the need to gain some partisan advantage at any given time, or to get into the situation that we have in so many states where you get gridlock because you've got one party controlling the governorship and the other controlling the state legislature, and so you end up with the devil's bargain that will just make everybody safe.
We've got a series of questions here about, I would describe them as what-if questions. We've got a certain system now where you've got winner-take-all, for instance. Minnesota, we now have Minneapolis, and then the next municipal election, St. Paul, that are trying a ranked choice voting system. Do you find that to be an appealing model to kind of move us away from, this plurality winners, some of which tend to be fairly ideologically extreme, and maybe open the door to third parties, as Tom Friedman suggested in this column on Sunday?
I'm uneasy about, I don't want to move to third, fourth, or fifth parties if I can avoid it. If you look at countries with proportional representation and those that have a significant number of parties, it doesn't work very well. One of the things that happens is you can end up with an even worse case where the balance of power is held by a small group with extreme views, and they can get what they want, which may be in smaller areas. And whether that is the ultra-religious parties in Israel or in some cases green parties or others, it's not terribly healthy. I prefer to have a system where you, of course you can step up as a third force, but where you basically have two parties that are larger tents. Now, there are a few things that I believe are worth considering here. One is I'm looking with great interest at California's innovation of having multi-candidate primaries with the two parties, where you have a much greater opportunity for a centrist to win under those circumstances. And if it works, that it's deeply annoying to partisans because the idea is they can't even choose their own candidates. Others will be involved. But having a small fringe group of activists choose the candidates that the rest of us have to vote on is much worse. Preference voting is something that's really worth considering, and it's been applied with, I think, some very good effects in many places. I also really don't like the idea, what we have in many states, where in a multi-candidate race, no matter how small the percentage of the leader, that's the winner. So we have a congressional seat in Arizona where Dan Quayle's son, Ben, in a low turnout primary and a safe Republican seat, got something like 23% of the votes. And he will now be a representative in that district for as long as he wants, unless he's redistricted out of it. And that means basically the people in the district didn't really have a chance to choose somebody. So I'd prefer to have some thresholds. And then let me just say, if I could do one thing, it would be something that is not going to happen here, but that is adopting some version of the Australian system of compulsory attendance at the polls. You know, in Australia, if you don't vote, and you don't have to vote, you can go and vote for none of the above, or you can just show up. But if you don't show up at the polls, you pay a fine. It's like a traffic ticket, a parking ticket, really, $15, $20. And as a consequence, they get, over decades of this, 95 to 97% turnout. People don't want to pay the fine. And what it means is your base is there. Their base is there. You don't have to spend tens of millions of dollars on political consultants trying to figure out a way to scare the crap out of your base so that they will turn out in numbers larger than the other side's base. And you don't focus on those wedge issues like abortion and same-sex marriage and guns and the like that get your base all excited but have little to do with the larger problems facing the country. In Australia, where you know everybody's going to be there, the focus is on those voters in the middle and on the big issues. And you don't use extreme rhetoric because in this case, extreme rhetoric can punish you. People in the middle who don't like it are not going to like you very much. So it has an impact on the issues and on the tone. But of course, we don't like mandatory anything.
I think you're right about that. We've got a next panel that flows and segues right into this. We're going to get into the consequences of redistricting as we've been doing it in Minnesota. It's going to really pick up on a lot of the themes that Norm Ornstein has provocatively laid out. I want to thank you very much. I know you're very busy, you travel all the time. You and Tom Friedman are real blessings for this country, and we appreciate all the work that you do and coming today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I promise I'll be back for the 7th game of the World Series.